There once was a young man who lived in a small village far away from the big city and the universities, and his parents were in agriculture, farmers even. They did not mind what the big city said. They weren't too much aware of the outside world. To go to high school, that young man had to travel 40 kilometers. So he often slept over at school. And sometimes when he went home, the roads were impassable because of floods. The name of that young man was Weiying Zhang, or Calvin Coolidge. Actually, the Coolidge trip was only 10 miles. That is also truly the story of Professor Zhang, who grew up not to be president, but to be a leader, president among economists in his nation, China. What President Coolidge and Professor Zhang have in common is an independent spirit that such a childhood gave them. Around 1983, Dr. Zhang wrote a little essay about the beauty of money. This was not here. This was in China only a few years after Chairman Mao's passing. The beauty of money. And so we asked him last night, did you realize when you were maybe 25 years old writing this essay, students sit up, what a risk you were taking? And Professor Zhang said, not really. That is how youth achieves, through ambition, through vision, and with a not entirely complete awareness of risk. That is only how we move forward, right? Anyhow, we welcome you very much. We have many eminences here, but I want to recognize Governor Jim Douglas, our trustee. Please stand up. I don't think Governor Douglas walked to boarding school, but almost.
Uphill both ways.
And my editor, Steve Forbes. We have many students in the room, and we are glad of that. Today we often wonder whether our economic metrics function, especially to capture the quality of growth. We've all been reading this weekend, Professor, about the IMF and how the yuan is going into this basket with special drawing rights currencies, a kind of signal of Chinese growth, but also world trust that China is real. And we wonder if the metrics we use to quantify China are valid. And we wonder if the metrics we use to quantify our own growth are valid. Those are related. And that is why the Coolidge Foundation, and I should mention very proudly our trustee David Johnson from Marketfield and Michael Aronstein, who will be speaking, we are co-hosting, are very proud to have Professor Weiying Zhang here tonight to speak about not just the Chinese economy, but the economy, the world economy. At some point in his career, very interesting, Professor Zhang sustained his independence. He decided to apply another set of metrics than macroeconomic metrics, or even Keynesianism, to his economy, and he turned away from macro and toward Hayek and Mises. Specifically, I think he explained to us, he warmed to Mises's concept of malinvestment. When money goes somewhere it might otherwise not go, perhaps for political reasons, or for reasons of the credit cycle. A little more background on Dr. Zhang. His outstanding book, I cannot recommend it too highly. It was a high point for me of the year to read this book. The Logic of the Market was a finalist for the 2016 Hayek Prize and was beautifully published with the aid of Ian Vasquez of Cato. I want to mention that because getting these things published is important and it takes serious work. I know also that David Johnson and Michael Aronstein will agree with me that this is the clearest book on China we have seen in years, and stands out amid a sea of boosterism books or dire human rights books, right? For its clarity. Of Professor Zhang's personal courage, you may also know, he was one of the founders of the Chinese economic reform. He will speak about that with Michael Aronstein. He is also a convinced Austrian. His headlines read such as, Keynesianism is completely wrong. He doesn't pussyfoot. And he was a dean at Guanghua School of Management, the Peking University, until 2010, when such statements became too much for the university. In fact, I forgot another headline, completely bury Keynesianism. That's another one of his headlines, and we are very excited about that. Just two more points. To interview and host Dr. Zhang, we do have Michael Aronstein, president of Marketfield Asset Management, who has long highlighted the challenges of the heavy hand of the government on the Chinese economy. In a recent interview, Michael criticized quantitative easing here and spoke a great truth, which I wrote down with my crayon. I liked it so much. All bull markets end with surges. I'll say that again. All bull markets end with surges in supply. Note well, housing market, United States. Here in China. I knew about Michael, actually I read about him in Bloomberg before I ever met him. Michael has long been famous for his accurate and bold long-range predictions. And I would like to double acknowledge our trustee David Johnson, his equally bold colleague. I'll just conclude and say that Michael will be interviewing Weiying, Professor Weiying, for about 15 to 20 minutes. This is for you students, so we want to have some time for your questions, and grown-up students too. We are especially glad to welcome my colleagues from the King's College, including Professor Mueller, who is teaching King students Austrian economics, and hope to get some questions from him. I want to mention too that this is the only part of the Weiying Zhang Roadshow of the Coolidge Foundation. Dr. Zhang was at Tuck, and we spoke also with Dartmouth undergraduates before he came here. He went to the Wall Street Journal today. He'll be on John Batchelor tonight, being interviewed by Gordon Chang. And then he goes to Washington to work with Cato. We cannot start without mentioning too that this club is lovely, and that Rashad Thomas and Matt Denhart and our new colleague Alexander Wallace made this event possible. Please do speak to them following the event. We call the economics which Dr. Zhang is applying Austrian, but really they are classical economics, perhaps that's a better name. The reason this relates to Coolidge, or a second reason, is the liberals of the 1920s practiced classical economics. That was Coolidge economics, and worried much about credit and bubbles as well. Inflation is repudiation, President Coolidge said. Deflation is assumption. We call the problems Dr. Zhang will be addressing Chinese, but they are really our own. May I welcome Michael Aronstein and Dr. Zhang to sit before us.
Amity, you didn't mention that I had to take the subway to school, the New York City subway. What I'd like to do, I'm going to ask Professor a few questions. We'll get into some of the topics that he feels are crucial to not only the global economy, but to China specifically. But I think all of his answers are quite general and apply really across the entire economic spectrum. And then we'll open it up for questions from the floor and try to make this as interactive as possible. And, I know I'm not up here to speak, so hey, Amity, you set the stage very well. And we've talked about this, that one of the great economic problems now is actually the discipline, the academic discipline of economics as it's currently taught. The way in which we measure things, the way in which we term things successful, the whole, I would say, Keynesian kind of system of demarcation and judgment has changed the way people describe success and failure in economic terms, and not to anybody's benefit. So I think it would be a good opening if you talked a little bit about the inherent problem conceptually and practically with the Keynesianism and the way it has been adopted.
I think Keynesian economics, a basic problem is that forecast and we call this aggregate demand. When we think about the economic growth, we always think that how much investment, how much consumption, how much trade. And then the thing is, yeah, government can do quite a lot. If private sector do not invest, the government can do that. If private do not consume, government can encourage it. And if trade not balanced, then the government can do something. So giving government too much power to interfere, actually that will make, reverse the logic of economics. Just like investment. For private sector, private business, why we invest? Because we think we can get more after invest, as we have return. But for government, they don't care how much return we will have. They only care how much we invest. No. Any investment, no matter how wasteful, it will create so-called aggregate demand.
And GDP.
Yeah, GDP. Actually, GDP is a concept that is useful if it's determined by the market, that consume value, goods, service. That is GDP. But if government creates demand, if just government value that, that's not real GDP. But in counting, we say that is GDP. So that's totally confused. Even you destroy wealth, you can also create GDP. Like you spend $1 million to build a new house. Then you spend another $1 million to build a bomb. Then you use this bomb to draw this house. You have 2 million GDP. Yeah. So that is, I think, is quite ridiculous. But really, government like that. Government always forecasts very short-term growth, like the target with how much GDP growth. This is particularly true in China. Chinese government always set a target. When they set target, they must reach that. Otherwise, we will lose faith. You know. So that is, I think, distorted economy. And even like consumption, why we produce? Because we want consumption. But in Keynesian economics, consumption is a tool for GDP. And why we consume, we eat, we have clothes, and because we want to target that GDP, like 8%, 10%. This is totally reverse this economic logic.
So GDP has become actually a goal,
Yeah.
rather than a useful measurement. And as a goal, it really distorts the actual meaning of economic activity and the growth of well-being. And one of the great criticisms that you've echoed and Mises articulated so well of government, what is called government investment, government spending, is that you wind up with an array of output that may or may not be useful to the citizenry.
Yeah.
And malinvestment.
Yeah, like it's suppose like a steel industry is already over capacity. So that is sort of is Keynesian economics. There's a sort of demand. So how to solve this demand? That is to build another new steel factory. Because when you build this new steel factory, this year you need demand, you have demand for steel. Yeah, but eventually that will create more overcapacity. Just cause more problems, not solve problem. So that's the Keynes policy, always create new problem, not solve the problem. Yeah, that's why I think we should completely bury this Keynes economics.
I agree. How much, China has been touted for producing very high growth rates on the surface. What proportion of the growth do you think has gone into malinvestment, into structures and capacity that really will not serve to make anybody's life any better?
It's difficult to calculate really how much, but my judgment is much of government investment wasteful. It's not really create something which ordinary people or consumers value that. And I think if you look at Chinese industries, many industries, so many overcapacity. And even already overcapacity, but the government still has policy to stimulate that. Particularly after the financial crisis. But the financial crisis caused here, America. But China has suffered and not benefit. Although China had a high growth rate, but really suffered from this financial crisis that's distorted investment, distorted resources allocation.
Yeah. If China doesn't change and withdraw some of the government intervention into the economy, what do you foresee as the consequences of that will be visible to the outside world, to somebody examining it with the kind of eye of an investor?
It's gone. I think that would be make China become more difficult to have growth. Like the investment today, is really very wasteful, and no the companies have no good incentive to make innovation, to make new products which serve people, serve consumers. And if government control a lot of resources, and what you should do, you always need to look at what government needs, what government prefer. If you do something government prefer, you will get benefit like subsidies and other kind of help. So that will not good for economic development in the long run.
Do you think it's possible to have an economy where the government is actively involved and not have a lot of corruption to go along with that?
Yeah, when government have power, control a lot of this, resources, the corruption is inevitable. Because all business people, they like to make money as quick as possible. And when government control resources, they do not need to really look at what consumers need, but they only look at what the government wants. What the consumers need is very different from what the government wants. So if you have good relation, good connection with government, you can always make money because you can get cheap resources. And if you make, if you make mistake, government will pay you, will cover your cost. So that would be inevitable.
I say that sitting here in New York City, which is known for not only its interventionist government these days, but more and more evidence of corruption. Not quite as widespread.
I think everywhere the same, and if government control too much resources, you will have big trouble. Economy will have big trouble.
Can you describe a little bit the changes that took place in China about a generation ago that allowed it to become somewhat more of a market-oriented economy from what it had been in the immediate post-Mao era?
In past 3 decades plan, and China has made a lot of change. and basic direction is go to market economy, but we still have a long way to go. Our reason is, although we